Valthor's thumb froze over the playback key, sweat cooling in his scarred palm. 46 times he had watched it. This would make 47. His command deck had gone silent around him, the way a room goes silent when everyone already knows the answer and no one wants to be the one who says it out loud. He pressed the key. 3.4 seconds of light bloomed across the display. A hull that should not have existed, a shape that moved wrong, accelerated wrong, that his sensor officers still could not name. And in the corner of the frame, behind a curve of viewport glass, a handful of small pale figures stood watching the wreckage of the Chrysler advance line the way a farmer watches weather roll in, no cheering, no shouting, no joy in any of their faces at all. That was the wrong part. The Conclave had spent 7,800 years teaching every officer in this fleet what victory looked like and what defeat looked like, and this was neither. These creatures were not celebrating a kill. They were simply noting one down. Valthor's scarred hand curled into a fist on the armrest. Somewhere behind him, an aide shifted his weight and said nothing, because nothing was the correct thing to say to a fleet master who had just watched 84 of his own ships die in 3.4 seconds and had not yet decided what that meant. The data slate in his other hand was warm. It had been warm for hours now from his own grip, from replaying it, from refusing to put it down. He had classified the human vessel as a transport once. A long time ago, he had never asked what it was transporting. I wish I could tell you the fleet walked away from this clean. It didn't. Stay with me a while longer. Because the worst part isn't the 84 ships. It's what the fleet had been looking at and calling harmless for longer than anyone alive could remember. The static under Valthor's ear kept hissing even after he set the slate down, and behind that hiss, if he let it pull him, he could still hear a quieter mourning, back before the 47 replays. Back when T-Kel was still just a scout with a route to fly and cold rations she didn't like. The Vengeance was not built for combat, it was built for seeing. 43 meters of hull, a crew of 12, and Scout Captain T-Kel in the pilot's seat with her brother's rank pin fixed crooked on her collar, because she'd fastened it in the dark that morning and hadn't bothered to fix it since. She was 27 years old. She had flown into unfamiliar systems before. This would be nothing new. Her tactical officer, a broad young Chrysler named Desic, cracked his ration bar in half and offered her the larger piece without being asked. She took it. Neither of them spoke. That was the rhythm they'd built over 3 years of runs together, and it worked, and she liked that it worked. 12 minutes to the gravity well, Desic said. Then we look, Kel said, and then we go home. She believed that when she said it. System 447 Kelvar unfolded ahead of them the way it always did on the display. 4 planets, a scatter of moons, and one blue-white world with a colony the Conclave's records called primitive. Doctrine said the humans there had no fleet worth the name. Dotrick had said that for 127 years, and Doctrine had never once been wrong, and T-Kel had grown up trusting that the way she trusted gravity. The recycled air on the Vengeance smelled faintly of hot metal and old coffee. A smell she associated with home more than her actual quarters did. She breathed it in, checked her harness, and eased the ship into its final approach. The passive sensor array woke first. A shape resolved on her screen, quiet and enormous, tucked in the shadow of the colony's outer moon. Her display gave her a mass reading and then, a half-second later, gave her the same reading again, as if it didn't believe itself either. Desic, she said. Run that a second time. He did. The number didn't change. 6 times larger than anything in the fleet's registry called a warship. A silhouette 340 meters long, sitting exactly where a vessel the Conclave logged as a diplomatic transport was supposed to be idling, harmless, unarmed, going nowhere. Desic's voice had gone flat. The way voices go flat when a person is trying very hard not to sound afraid. That's not a transport. No, T-Kel said. It's not. For a long moment, neither of them said anything else. The ship on her screen sat perfectly still. Then it wasn't still anymore. A number on her console ticked upward, then upward again, faster than any acceleration curve she had a name for, and her stomach dropped the way it did on the worst kind of turbulence, except there was no turbulence. Run, she said, and hit transmit, and behind her Desic was already reaching for the restraint harness he hadn't needed in 3 years of quiet runs, both of them staring at a number that kept climbing, waiting to find out how far it would go before somebody. There was just the thing on her screen, closing distance that shouldn't have been closable, and every instinct she had, every year of training, screaming the same single word at her before she had even decided to say it out loud. Her thumb found the emergency channel. Somewhere in this fleet actually listened. 7 light seconds away, on the command deck of the Eternal Conquest, Fleet Master Valthor received the word and did not like the sound of it. "Run," his signals officer repeated. "That's the whole message, sir." From the scout ship. Valthor's scarred hand flexed once on the armrest, an old habit from an old wound, the kind of thing his crew had learned to read like weather. He did not like panic on a channel meant for real threats. He liked it less when the panic came from a captain he'd trusted with recon for 3 years running. "Pull the sensor feed," he said. The image came up grainy, a shape against the dark near the colony moon, nothing his eye could make sense of at that distance. Half a heartbeat of visual, then static. He watched it twice. "Sensor malfunction," he said. "The scout is panicking." His tactical officer, a younger crisser named Fessin, glanced at the readout a beat longer than he should have. "If it's a malfunction, sir, why did the scout transmit on the existential threat channel and not the standard recon line?" Valthor didn't answer that. He didn't have an answer that satisfied him either, and a fleet master who admits doubt in front of his bridge crew is a fleet master who has already lost something he can't get back. Doctrine had held for longer than his own life had lasted. He was not going to be the officer who broke it over one scout's nerves. "Signal the advance line," he said instead. "Blockade formation. Standard spacing." The formation had a name older than anyone currently flying it. Crisser fleets had used it across 6 conquered systems, unbroken, and the shape of it, a wide crescent, ship space to funnel anything that came through into overlapping fire, had never once failed to hold. The hammer of Crisser took position near the crescent's leading edge. Its captain was a broad-shouldered veteran named Kurav, T-Kel's older brother, a man who kept a small carved token from their home shore clipped inside his collar, the same way she kept his old rank pin on hers. He didn't know she'd sent the warning. The message had gone straight to command. He only knew what every captain in the line knew. Something was out there. The fleet master had called it nothing, and the formation would hold because it always had. He checked his restraints out of habit, not fear. Across the crescent, dozens of ships settled into their spacing, engines idling, weapons hot, waiting for a target that hadn't shown itself yet. Back on the Vengeance, Kel watched the blockade form on her long-range display and felt something cold settle behind her ribs that had nothing to do with the ship's environmental controls. "They didn't listen," Desic said. She thought of Korav's ship taking its place at the front of that crescent, and she thought about pulling her own vessel closer, doing something, anything. "They never do," she said, and hated how true it sounded out loud, and she knew with the same certainty that told her gravity worked that there was nothing a 43-meter scout ship could do that a battle line of advanced warships couldn't do better. So she watched. That was what the Vengeance was built for. Watching had never felt like such a small, useless thing before. The reading on her screen held steady. The human ship sat where it had been, patient, unmoving, close enough to the colony that it looked, for one long stretch of silence, like it might simply stay there forever. Then it didn't. The thing about Doctrine, Valthor would think much later, staring at a data slate that never seemed to cool down, is that it teaches you what to expect so thoroughly that you stop being able to see what's actually in front of you. 7,800 years of unbroken victory does something to a mind. It stops asking questions Doctrine has already answered. He would have plenty of time to think about that. Right now, on the bridge of the Eternal Conquest, he only had a countdown to the crescent closing and a scout captain's single word still sitting in his mind like a splinter he refused to pull out. "Report," he said, when the human ship's position updated on his own long-range display. "Holding position, sir," Fessin said. Then a beat later, quieter, "Wait." Valthor leaned forward. On the display, the human vessel's velocity reading ticked upward the exact same way it had on T-Kel's screen, except now Valthor was watching it happen in real time, on his own bridge, with his own eyes, and no scout captain's supposed panic to blame it on. "That's not possible," Fessin said. "Nothing accelerates like that." "Signal the crescent," Valthor said, and for the first time that day his voice had lost its certainty. "Tell them to." He didn't finish the order. There was nothing left to tell them that would matter in time. On the hammer of Crisar, Kurav had exactly long enough to see the reading spike on his own console, long enough to reach for the token clipped inside his collar the way he always did before anything dangerous, and no longer than that. The human ship didn't fire. That detail would matter more than anything else once the fleet had time to sit with it. It didn't fire a single weapon. It simply moved, faster than anything in the Dominion's registry had a name for, and where it passed through the Crescent's leading edge, ships stopped existing in a way that had nothing to do with explosions or wreckage fields. One moment the hammer of Chrysar held its position in the line. The next, Korav's console was dead. His restraints were meaningless, and 84 ships across the Crescent's front had simply ceased. On the Eternal Conquest, alarms that had never needed to sound in Valthor's 43 years of service sounded all at once. Behind her, Desic said her name once and she didn't answer, because she was already reaching for the recorder, already pulling every scrap of data the Vengeance's sensors had caught in that impossible handful of seconds. On the Vengeance, Tikel watched her brother's ship disappear from the tactical display without a single flare of weapons fire to explain it. And her hands, for the first time in 9 years of flying, would not stop shaking, because someone was going to need proof of what had just happened. And she was terrified that if she didn't save it now, the fleet would find a way to explain it away the same way Valthor had explained away her warning. The transmission that came through from the dying advance line lasted exactly as long as it lasted and then went silent, and in the last frame before the hammer of Chrysar's signal died, Tikel's shaking hands caught something that made her stop breathing. Behind a curve of viewport glass on the human ship, small pale figures stood watching the wreckage spread out beneath them. They were not celebrating. They were simply watching, the way you'd watch weather roll across a field you'd stood in 100 times before, and Tikel understood, in the space of that single frozen frame, that whatever she was looking at had never once been afraid of the fleet bearing down on it. Valthor was on his feet before the alarms finished their first cycle. "Get me full sensor data. Everything the Vengeance caught," he said, and his voice had none of the calm certainty it carried an hour ago. "And get me the scout captain." Now, the bridge of the Eternal Conquest had gone from routine to wreckage in less time than it took most crews to finish a shift change. Officers who had spent careers waiting for orders now stood frozen at stations that had nothing useful left to report. 84 ships, gone in a single pass, and not one weapon fired to explain it. Fessen's hands were shaking on his console. "Sir, the advance line isn't responding. Any of it." "I know," Valthor said. He did not shout it. He said it the way a man says something when the shouting has already happened somewhere behind his ribs and there's nothing left to do but speak plainly. Tekel sat very still in the Vengeance's pilot chair with her brother's rank pin pressed flat under her palm, and she did not cry because there wasn't room for it yet. Desic didn't say anything either. He'd flown with Korov twice years back before he'd transferred to scout duty, and he understood well enough to leave the silence alone. "Send the data," she finally said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "All of it." "You think they'll try to bury it?" "I think doctrine doesn't like being wrong," she said. "And I think a fleetmaster who ignored a warning isn't going to want that warning remembered." She was already pulling the recorded frames into a private archive of her own by the time the transfer to command completed. The 3.4 seconds of the hammer of Chrysar's dying transmission saved twice over, once for the fleet and once for herself. "To command, to the Conclave archive, to anyone who will take it. I want a copy that can't be buried." Desic looked at her, because some part of her, the part that had grown up watching her brother polish that same rank pin every morning before a shift, didn't trust the fleet to keep it honest. On a quiet transport 3 systems distant, an elder of the Mavari delegation named Sarvati received the same data feed everyone in the Conclave's extended network received, and she did not react the way the rest of the network reacted. She had been waiting for this. They were watchers, patient in a way the Chrysar had never valued, and had never tried very hard to understand, and for longer than most officers currently serving had been alive. Sarvati had kept her own private record of the human colony, its silences. Sarvati's people were not warriors, its refusals to explain itself, the small strange gaps in what it chose to show the Conclave, and what it chose to hide. She opened a channel directly to Valthor's flagship, not through the usual chain of command. Directly. "Fleetmaster," she said, when his face appeared on the display, hollow-eyed and unshaven in a way she had never once seen from him. "Mine." She told him about the decades she'd spent logging human behavior. Nobody else had thought worth logging arrival patterns for ships that never seemed to carry cargo consistent with their manifests. "I need you to listen to something before the rest of the Conclave decides what this means." Valthor's scarred hand flexed against the edge of his console. Elder, this isn't the time for a debate on protocol. It isn't a debate, Sarvati said. It's a confession. Construction yards that produced far more hull material than the colony's registered fleet could account for. Silences in diplomatic exchanges exactly where a species with something to hide would go quiet. The vessel you classified as a diplomatic transport, Sarvati said, was never a transport. It was a lie the humans let us believe because it was easier than explaining what it actually was. And it was not the only one. Valthor said nothing. Somewhere behind his eyes, Tikel thought, watching the exchange relayed to her own console. A man who had built 43 years of certainty on doctrine was watching that certainty come apart one sentence at a time. How many? He finally said. More than one, Sarvati said. Built quietly. Built patiently. Valthor sat with his scarred hand resting flat against the ceremonial plate on his chest, the 6 system markings that recorded 6 conquered worlds, and for the first time in longer than anyone on that bridge had served under him. While we told each other a story about primitives who posed no threat, because that story was comfortable, and comfortable stories don't get questioned, there was a strange stillness on the Eternal Conquest's bridge in the minutes after that channel closed. He did not move to touch the chalice of soil kept beside his command chair. He simply sat. Fessin brought him a cup of recycled water he hadn't asked for. Valthor took it, held it, didn't drink it. Small, ordinary things, the kind a person reaches for when the large things have stopped making sense. Then he set the cup down, untouched, and reached instead for the data slate. The full transmission was 3.4 seconds long, and Valthor had already watched fragments of it a dozen times in the chaos of the last hour. But this time he watched it whole, alone, with the bridge crew pretending not to notice. Hull composition the sensors couldn't classify, an acceleration curve that broke every model the Dominion's engineers had ever built. And in the final half-second, the observation blister and the human figure standing calm behind that curve of glass, watching 84 ships stop existing without so much as a flicker of triumph on their faces. He understood, watching it that 7th or 8th time, that he had been looking at this species for 127 years and had never once asked the only question that mattered. Not what can they do, what have they been waiting for? The answer arrived less than an hour later, and it arrived the worst possible way, in motion. Long-range sensors across the crescent's shattered remnant picked up the human vessel changing heading, not toward the colony, not away from the fleet. Toward the fleet's main body, where 900 and some ships still held formation around the Eternal Conquest, waiting for orders that made sense. It's not slowing, Fessin said. It's not slowing at all. Valthor stood, the data slate still warm in his hand, and looked at the tactical display the way a man looks at a door he already knows he isn't going to open in time. Somewhere behind that curve of glass, 12 figures were still watching, patient, unhurried, the way you watch something you have already decided the outcome of. Signal the fleet, Valthor said. All ships, fall back. Nobody on the bridge asked him to repeat it. Nearly the whole fleet turned inside minutes, a tide of hulls pulling away from the human vessel's path, and the Eternal Conquest itself came about last. Partition 4, expand. The retreat did not happen quietly. Ships broke formation across the crescent's shattered remnant, engines flaring hard as captains who had spent their whole careers trusting doctrine now trusted only the order in front of them. Fall back. Valthor, watching his own retreat order carried out on a display that had shown nothing but advance and conquest for as long as he'd held command. The human ship did not pursue, it simply held its course, unhurried, and let the fleet run. It's not following, Fessin said, voice raw with disbelief. Sir, it's just watching us leave. Valthor said nothing. He understood now, in a way he wished he didn't, exactly what that meant. The ship had never needed to chase anyone. It had already proven what it came to prove. Across the retreating fleet, the news of the Crescent's destruction did not arrive all at once. It arrived the way bad news always arrives on a warship, in fragments, passed hand to hand, growing heavier with every relay. On the Resolute, 3 ships back from where the hammer of Chrysar had held its position, a young signals officer named Auric was the one who had to read the casualty manifest aloud to his deck. He had trained with 2 of the dead. He got through the first name clean. On the second, his voice caught and he stopped, and nobody on that bridge told him to continue, because nobody wanted to hear it said out loud either. Word reached the colonies attached to the Crescent's home port before the fleet itself did. Wives, husbands, Children who had grown up watching ships leave for campaigns that always came home victorious now stood on docking platforms waiting for ships that weren't coming home at all. There was no ceremony ready for this. The Dominion had never needed one. 7,800 years of doctrine had built monuments to conquest and left nothing standing for loss. On the Vengeance, T. Kell watched the same retreat unfold on her own display, her brother's rank pin still pressed under her palm where it had been for the last hour. Desic didn't try to comfort her. He simply flew the ship, steady, giving her the silence she needed the way he always had. But the silence didn't hold all the way through. I flew with him, Desic said finally, not looking at her, before scout duty. 2 years, on a supply run rotation. He used to give half his ration to whoever complained the loudest, just to shut them up. Never said why. I think he liked being the one who fixed small problems, because the big ones were never his to fix. Tikel didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was thinner than she wanted it to be. He gave me half his ration the morning I shipped out for my first posting. Told me I looked like I was about to be sick. Were you? Yes. Desic almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to his face, but the attempt was there, and she was grateful for it anyway. That steadiness was its own kind of grief, shared without a word spoken, and for a moment the two of them sat with it together instead of alone. She thought about the message she'd sent to command, the second copy she'd saved in her own private archive, because she hadn't trusted the fleet to remember what it had done wrong. She hadn't known, sending it, that it would end up being the thing that broke a fleetmaster's certainty. She had only known she couldn't let it disappear. Sarvati's channel opened once more, this time to the wider Conclave network, every surviving ship in the retreating fleet receiving it at once. Her voice was quiet, the way it had always been, the way the Chrysar had spent 7,000 years mistaking for weakness. "We watched a god die," she said. It was not the one we expected. No cheering answered her. No fleet-wide alarm. Just silence, the kind that settles over a room when everyone finally understands the same thing at the same moment. Valthor sat with the data slate in his scarred hand and did not reply to the message. He read it once. He read it a second time. Then he set the slate down on the console beside the untouched cup of water, and for the first time in 43 years of service, he did not reach for the chalice of conquered world soil beside his chair. He left it where it was. The political fallout began before the fleet had even finished its retreat. Other fleet commanders, stationed in systems far from 447 Kelvar, began requesting emergency channels to the Warspire the moment Sarvati's broadcast reached them. One commander, an old rival of Valthor's named Braxu, who had spent 3 decades arguing that the Dominion's expansion had grown reckless, sent a message that reached the Eternal Conquest within the hour. "You held the line the doctrine gave you?" Braxu's message read, and the line broke anyway. Perhaps it was never the line that mattered. Valthor did not answer that one either. There was nothing in him left to spend on an old rival's satisfaction at being right. He had spent 43 years building a career on the idea that fear needed managing more than truth needed telling, and the ship in his tactical feed had managed to teach him otherwise without firing a single shot. The Warspire's High Command convened an emergency session within a day of the retreat, the first such session called without 7 days' formal notice in longer than the Dominion's oldest serving officer could remember. Valthor was not present. He had not been summoned, and he had not asked to be. He sat instead on the bridge of the Eternal Conquest, watching status reports scroll past that no longer meant anything to him and let the debate happen without him. He was not stripped of rank. Nobody imprisoned him. His defeat was quieter than that. And worse, he simply stopped being certain of anything in front of a bridge crew who had trusted his certainty their entire careers. A man who had built 43 years on the idea that fear should be managed, not told the truth, had finally been told the truth he could not manage at all. Elder Sarvati, for her part, did not wait for the conclave summons either. She opened a private log, the kind she had kept for decades without anyone in command bothering to ask what was in it, and began writing down what she had known and when she had known it. She had started watching the human colony 47 years earlier, back when the first strange gaps in their trade manifests had caught her attention. Cargo listed as agricultural equipment that never once matched the mass or heat signature of agricultural equipment. She had flagged it quietly, through channels nobody senior ever read, and been told politely and repeatedly that the matter did not warrant further conclave resources. She had kept watching anyway. That was what her people did. She thought, writing the log about all the small silences she had catalogued over those decades, a shipyard expansion here, an unexplained energy signature there, a diplomatic delegation that answered every question about their fleet capacity with careful, polite. Nobody had ever thanked them for it, and until 3.4 seconds of transmitted horror had forced the entire Dominion to reconsider, nobody ever would have. Technically true, non-answers. None of it had been a lie. Exactly. It had simply never been the whole truth, and the Dominion had never once thought to ask for more than it was given. The fleet that made it home carried word ahead of itself, and the word spread faster than any ship could fly. The Dominion's doctrine, unbroken for 7,800 years, had met something it never bothered to measure, and it had lost without a single shot fired in its own defense. Every system that had ever felt safe behind Chrysler's strength now understood that safety had been a story, not a fact. In the systems bordering 447 Kelvar, local governors quietly began reviewing their own defensive assumptions for the first time in generations. Military academies that had taught the same unbroken formation for centuries found themselves, within weeks, drafting new doctrine documents nobody had thought necessary a month earlier. It would take years for the shockwave to fully settle. Nobody serving now would live to see the doctrine rebuilt into something that questioned itself before disaster forced the question. Tikel stood alone in her quarters some time later, off-duty, the Vengeance docked and quiet around her. She had requested the file be returned to her once the Conclave's investigators finished with it, and they had, without much argument, because nobody in command wanted to be the one holding on to evidence of what doctrine had cost. She sat on the edge of her bunk and set the data slate in her lap. Her brother's rank pin sat beside it, unfastened now, resting flat on the blanket where she'd finally taken it off her collar. She pressed play. 3.4 seconds, hull composition unknown. An acceleration curve nothing in the registry could explain, and in the last half-second, behind the curve of glass, the calm faces watching wreckage the way you'd watch weather roll across a field you'd stood in 100 times before. She had watched this frame more times than she could count anymore. She still didn't understand it. Not really. Not the patience of it, the stillness, the absence of anything like triumph in 12 faces that had just ended a war before it started. But she understood. Finally, what Sarvati had meant. They had not been hiding because they were weak. They had been waiting. The data slate was warm against her palm, the way it always was now. Warm from her own hands, from months of holding it. From a truth she couldn't put down even when she wanted to. She turned it over once, feeling the crack along its edge where she'd gripped it too hard the day it first arrived. Desic found her there a while later, standing in the doorway without knocking, the way he'd learned he was allowed to over 3 years of quiet runs together. He didn't say anything about the slate, or the pin, or what either of them meant. He just leaned against the frame and stayed. "You could stop watching it," he said eventually. "I know," she said. "You're not going to, though." "No," she said. "Not yet." He nodded, like that was an answer he'd expected, and didn't push further. That was the rhythm they'd built over 3 years, and it still worked, even now, even with everything different. She set the pin down beside the slate, both of them resting together on the blanket in the quiet dark of her quarters. Outside, through the small viewport above her bunk, the stars held still the way they always had, indifferent to empires and doctrine, and the small, stubborn patience of a species no one had thought to measure. Tikel did not press play again. She turned off the light instead, and sat there a while longer, the pin and the slate side by side in the dark.